Hello my fellow weirdlings, it's Margot, and today I'm talking about a lady named Mary Bateman, also known as the Yorkshire Witch, who possessed a prophetic hen, a wild imagination, and some murderous tendencies. So if you're ready for some bizarre history, keep watching. History, much like today's World Wide Web, is full of charlatans, people claiming to possess magical powers, miracle elixirs, or spiritual answers. The story of the Yorkshire Witch and her apocalyptic chicken is one for the ages. Nowadays, Mary Bateman would probably be seen as an influencer, and I have no doubt that she'd have millions of TikTok followers. Mary Harker was born in 1768 in the village of Azenby, North Yorkshire, England, into a farming family. Nevertheless, she seemingly received a decent education and was able to read and write proficiently. By her own admission, she was of a knavish and vicious disposition, and by age 12 was an accomplished thief. From the age of 13, she worked as a servant girl in the village of Thurst. At age 20, Mary moved to York, where she worked as a dressmaker. But that only lasted about a year before she had to leave town, after being caught red-handed committing a burglary. According to one biography, Mary, quote, displayed what may have been a pathological need to steal. She was, moreover, none too discreet in the manner of her robberies. Even at this relatively young age, she'd already been caught in the act of stealing multiple times. It's believed that she may have had a habit of bribing her victims to keep them from reporting her to the authorities. I can't help but wonder if she'd also threatened them in some way. Either way, she'd never experienced any real repercussions for her criminal behavior. After her abrupt departure from York, Mary settled in Leeds. Over the next 4 years, she worked as a mantua maker. Mantua makers were dressmakers who used a process called cutting to the body to create very fitted clothing for women. In 1792, at the age of 24, Mary married an honest, hard-working man named John Bateman, who worked as a wheelwright, making and repairing wooden wheels for horse-drawn vehicles. The couple had known each other for only 3 weeks. Though Mary had a very marketable skill, she wasn't particularly adept at it, and therefore catered mostly to servant girls who couldn't afford to pay a lot for her services. So she found something even more marketable: fortune-telling. She began to build a reputation as a wise woman and a fixer of problems. Over the next few years, she also committed multiple robberies. Though she was caught several times, she managed to escape serving prison time by reportedly bribing the witnesses to her crimes. When Mary was 28 in 1796, her husband John joined Britain's supplemental militia. It seems this may have been, at least in part, John's effort to distance himself from the embarrassment Mary had caused with her illegal antics. He took Mary with him on his travels, where she seemingly learned and employed new methods of theft and deception. They returned to Leeds within the year. As they settled back into domestic life in Leeds, Mary continued to enhance her bad reputation, all the while gaining a pretty loyal following that were apparently willing to ignore her propensity for thievery and stretching the truth past its breaking point. At around this time, Mary began claiming to be an agent for the fictitious character called Mrs. Moore. According to Mary, Mrs. Moore was the 7th child of a 7th child, and therefore possessed the supernatural ability to remove curses by, quote, screwing down those who would cause her clients harm. Over time, Mary introduced another fictional character to her clients, a Miss Blythe. Miss Blythe was a more run-of-the-mill psychic who could read the stars. Of course, nobody but Mary ever saw or spoke to either Mrs. Moore or Miss Blythe, as she always acted as their go-between, relaying messages between the two imaginary women and their clients. Mary would take the clients' names, queries, and of course their money, and then return to them with their predictions or instructions and any charms Mrs. Moore or Miss Blythe had decided they'd need. People of varying social standings would come to Mary to help them fix their various problems, which consisted of everything from stopping cheating spouses and removing curses, to predicting their future, curing their ills, and even performing abortions. This sort of wise woman fortune-teller pseudo-witchery was actually a fairly common hustle in Georgian England. And somehow, against all evidence of her dishonesty and unscrupulousness, These clients literally trusted Mary with their lives, until many of them found out the hard way that she was elaborately scamming them out of all of their worldly belongings. At one point, Mary was reported to have even begged for money and goods on the streets of Leeds to benefit the displaced victims of a major fire, but instead of delivering those donations to the rightful recipients, she kept them for herself. Another incident, which was very typical of Mary's modus operandi, occurred when a neighbor of Mary's became ill and died, leaving behind a widow and 4 children. The widow was the children's stepmother, and Mary managed to convince her that the family's eldest son, who was about 15 years old, intended to sell what little property the family possessed and run off with it. To prevent this, she persuaded the woman to sell everything as soon as possible and leave. The widow took Mary's advice, leaving behind a share of money with Mary for the children. Of course, Mary kept all of it for herself and sent the children to an orphanage. Mary's own family wasn't immune to this egregious behavior. She once delivered a letter to her husband's workplace, claiming his father, the town crier of Thirsk, was dying. John rushed to his father's bedside, but when he arrived in Thirsk, he immediately heard his father's voice in the marketplace, announcing an auction, and realized it had all been a hoax. When he arrived back in Leeds, he found that every article of furniture in his house had been stripped away and sold by his wife. The money from the sale was unaccounted for. Later, Mary pulled a similar trick on her sister-in-law, sending her away to deal with the supposedly imminent death of her father, so she could rob her blind in her absence. While the sister-in-law was away, Mary also convinced her brother to leave his wife, persuading him to send a letter informing his wife of his decision. The sister-in-law returned and managed to convince Mary's brother that Mary had manipulated him. When Mary realized she'd lost control over her brother's decision-making, she turned him in for deserting from the British Navy. Following this, he was returned to military service. But this wasn't enough for Mary, who wrote to her mother telling her that her son had been apprehended as a deserter and would need £10 to pay someone else to do his time for him. The money was sent, and of course, Mary kept it for herself. In 1806, at the age of 38, it said that Mary joined the followers of the self-described religious prophetess Joanna Southcott and attended meetings. It seems that this is when things went even more sideways. Joanna Southcott, or Southcote, was a Wesleyan servant woman from Devon, England, who delivered her prophecies in rhyme. Her cult-like following became known as the Southcottian Movement, and Southcott announced herself as the woman of the Apocalypse, spoken of in Revelation. Her teachings are actually still practiced today by 3 different religions. Southcott's story will be a whole other video. She was a doozy. While involved in the Southcottian Movement, Mary is even reported to have robbed the homes of many of Southcott's faithful followers, sometimes by exploiting their fears and other times by outright theft. But even shortly before Mary's purported introduction to the Southcottian Movement, something happened that many believe was a crime perpetrated by Mary that crossed the line from simple scamming into doing serious physical harm. At some time prior to 1803, 2 Quaker sisters from a family named Kitchin befriended Mary and apparently became her clients, while she also helped out in their local drapery shop. In September of 1803, one of the Kitchin sisters suddenly fell ill of an unknown cause. Mary treated her illness with special powders that she'd prepared. In less than a week, the young lady was dead. Hearing of her daughter's illness and death, the Kitchin sisters' mother arrived. Soon afterward, the second Kitchin sister and their mother also fell ill and quickly died. The deaths were blamed on cholera, which can display the same symptoms as poisoning. Mary, however, blamed the deaths on the plague. While the plague wasn't particularly virulent in England in 1803, the locals were fearful enough of infection to avoid getting involved. It said that a local doctor had even examined the women prior to their deaths and was so convinced they were being poisoned, he searched their house. But once the entire family was dead, there was nobody to give permission for him to perform autopsies on the bodies. When creditors looked into the Kitchin estate, they discovered the drapery shop and family home had been stripped bare. Their account books were also suspiciously missing, but for some odd reason, Mary was never questioned, and nobody seemed to openly suspect her for the Kitchin women's deaths until much later. It's thought that Mary's involvement with the Southcottian Movement and the so-called Woman of the Apocalypse inspired her next bizarre scheme that ended in her most attention-grabbing scandal. Like many people of her time, Mary kept chickens, which supplied her household with fresh eggs. However, in 1806, Mary claimed to possess a chicken that provided her with something far more valuable and intriguing than breakfast. Mary claimed one of her hens had begun laying eggs inexplicably inscribed with the misspelled message, "Christ is coming." Mary's hen became known as the Prophet Hen of Leeds, and word quickly spread of the hen's message, which was believed to herald the end times. Droves of people lined up to pay a penny to see the magical hen and her mystical eggs. Mary kept 3 of them on display, but the audience could also witness the hen actually laying a prophetic egg every morning. Upon seeing the eggs, witnesses were whipped into a frenzy, convinced the apocalypse or rapture was on its way. Never one to do anything in a half-assed manner, Mary even began selling seals that ensured admission into heaven upon the apocalypse. These seals were actually just pieces of paper with the letters JC written on them. But not everybody wholeheartedly believed in the Prophet Hen of Leeds and her magical apocalyptic eggs. A small group of skeptics decided to get up extra early in the morning before the crowd could gather and hid near Mary's house to observe her. The book Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds describes what they saw, stating, "Some gentlemen, hearing of the matter, went one fine morning and caught the poor hen in the act of laying one of her miraculous eggs. They soon ascertained beyond doubt that the egg had been inscribed with some corrosive ink, and cruelly forced up again into the bird's body. At this explanation, those who had prayed now laughed, and the world wagged as merrily as of yore." So specifically what the men discovered was that Mary, using basic chemistry, had been writing on the eggs with concentrated vinegar, which is a solution of acetic acid. Eggshells are mostly made of calcium carbonate, which is an ingredient often used in antacids and also dissolves in acid. So when the vinegar was painted onto the eggs, the acetic acid reacted with the calcium carbonate in a chemical reaction that produced carbon dioxide, water, and calcium acetate. This dissolved the eggshell just enough to engrave the lettering of the miracle message without damaging the inner membranes of the egg. Mary added multiple layers of vinegar to ensure the message was sufficiently burned in. Once the eggs were prepared, Mary would unfortunately cram the egg back up into the bird's cloaca, the opening eggs come out of. That allowed the audience to witness the chicken actually laying the inscribed eggs when the bird pushed them back out. After this scam was exposed to the public, Mary sold her hen to a neighbor. It never laid another apocalyptic egg, not so much as a greetings or salutations. But Mary, of course, wasn't deterred from continuing to scam people in her usual ways. In the same year as the prophetic hen debacle, 1806, a woman named Rebecca Perigo consulted Mary about a persistent pain in her breast. Some accounts claim that Rebecca suffered from a nervous disorder. Mary informed her the pain was the result of an evil wish placed on Rebecca by an enemy. Mary, supposedly on the advice of the fictitious Miss Blythe, began feeding both Rebecca and her husband William a special pudding that was to be consumed by nobody but them. The Perigos treatment also involved sewing money into silk bags that supposedly could be accessed by the Perigos once the curse was removed. This took place over the course of 18 months, during which Miss Blythe also continually demanded money for china, silver, and even a new bed, which was purportedly a necessity for her supernatural workings. The Perigos were advised to burn all correspondence with Miss Blythe and Mary to ward off evil spirits. Eventually, the Perigos received a letter purportedly from Miss Blythe, which read, "My dear friends, I am sorry to tell you you will take an illness in the month of May next, either one or both, but I think both. But the works of God must have its course. You will escape the chambers of the grave. Though you seem to be dead, yet you will live. Your wife must take 1/2 pound of honey down from Bramley to Mary Bateman's at Leeds, and it must remain there till you go down yourself, and she will put in such like stuff as I have sent from Scarborough to her, and she will put it in when you come down and see her yourself, or it will not do. You must eat pudding for 6 days, and you must put in such like stuff as I have sent to Mary Bateman from Scarborough, and she will give your wife it, but you must not begin to eat of this pudding until I let you know. If ever you find yourself sickly at any time, you must take each of you a teaspoonful of this honey. I will remit 20 pounds to you on the 20th day of May, and it will pay a little of what you owe. You must bring this down to Mary Bateman's and burn it at her house when you come down the next time." Of course, this was concerning, so the Perigos again consulted Miss Blythe through Mary for clarification. Mary gave them a special powder to mix into their pudding. The instructions that came with it were 1. Only the Perigos must eat it, and 2. They shouldn't call for a doctor. Not the least bit suspicious. William later recalled that upon eating this pudding, a violent heat came out of his mouth which was very sore, that his lips were black, and that he had a most violent pain in his head, 20 times worse than a common headache, and that everything appeared green to him. But William did survive this apparent poisoning. Sadly, Rebecca did not. Perhaps the weirdest part of this story is that William continued to employ the counsel of Miss Blythe via Mary, who continued to ask for more money and even Rebecca's clothing. I can't help but wonder if Mary did all of this just because she wanted Rebecca's belongings, similarly to what seemingly happened with the kitchen women. A couple years would go by before William started to have some doubts about Mary in 1809. His suspicions were finally confirmed when he pulled the stitches out of the silk purses that his money was supposedly sewn into and found nothing but scraps. Shortly afterward, he called the constable. When confronted by the authorities, Mary accused William of being the real poisoner, declaring, "That bottle which you gave me yesterday night has almost poisoned me and my husband, who is ill in bed in consequence of taking it." But then other Leeds residents began to come forward telling their own stories of theft, extortion, and even other suspected and attempted poisonings at the hands of Mary Bateman. It's also claimed that a search of Mary's home turned up the poison in many belongings of the Perigos and her other clients, many of which hadn't been given to Mary willingly. John Bateman, Mary's husband, was taken into custody to be tried as an accomplice for Mary's crimes. He eventually convinced the court that he'd been unaware of what his wife had been up to, and was acquitted. As the townspeople compared their own experiences, it quickly became apparent that Mary was guilty of far more than anyone had suspected. People suddenly were able to connect the dots between Mary and the deaths of the Kitchen family 6 years prior. It also came to their realization that neither Miss Blythe nor Mrs. Moore, both so much a part of many of their lives, had ever existed. In comparing their handwriting, Mary's matched Miss Blythe's exactly. She never did attempt to explain why. According to the Criminal Chronology of York Castle by William Knipe, which was written in 1867, Mary's trial took place in March of 1809 and lasted 11 hours, with the jury taking only a few minutes to find her guilty of fraud and the murder of Rebecca Perigo. Immediately upon being sentenced to death by hanging, Mary announced that she was 22 weeks pregnant, and therefore her execution would have to be postponed. The judge ordered that a panel of 12 matrons or married women be sworn into the jury to assess Mary's condition. The matrons conducted a physical examination of Mary and determined that she was not pregnant. Knipe's 1867 account also mentioned that Mary had a daughter at home and an infant child in prison with her. It said that she mailed her wedding ring home to her husband to give to their daughter. Mary Bateman was hanged at noon on Monday, March 20th, 1809, along with 2 men who'd been sentenced to death for unrelated crimes. She was 40 years old. After Mary's death, her body was dissected, and even that turned into a public circus. Humans have always been intrigued with true crime and gore, and thousands paid to see Mary's corpse cut up and on display at Leeds General Infirmary. As a souvenir, they could purchase a small piece of her cured skin. Some even saw them as good luck charms. Rumor has it her skin was even used to bind several books, at least one of which was owned by the future King George IV. Mary's death was basically a tabloid sensation at the time, with books and periodicals published in quick succession after her hanging. One book, first published in 1811, called The Extraordinary Life and Character of Mary Bateman, was in print for 12 editions. Mary's body was later kept on display at the Thackeray Medical Museum in Leeds, where it remained until 2015 when it was moved to Leeds University. There it rests today. She's been dubbed the Yorkshire Witch and has become something of a folk hero, or villain. In 1867, William Knipe theorized that Mary was addicted to crime. Historian Owen Davies has described Mary as having a pathological need to steal. It's amazing the level of sensationalism that has always followed interesting true crime stories. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this story and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have any opinions on this topic, I'd love to hear all about them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.